All right. My watch says 7 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get started. Before we get to the program, I just want to do a couple quick plugs for Newton Public Library and what we have coming up. Of course, today's program you're watching is Kansas Boy, the Memoir of A.J. Bolinger, with the editors Jeffrey H. Barker and Melissa Walker. And coming up, we've got a week from today, fourth Tuesday photography. That's going to be Sean Tomlinson, and the subject is planning and enjoying a photo trip to Western Kansas. So he will show some photos from a recent trip that he took with some friends and talk a bit about how you can plan your own photo trip or just your own trip to Western Kansas. Should be a lot of fun. Then 2 days after that, on Thursday, April 29th, this is kind of a late edition, so I hope I'll tell your friends about it, because I'd really love to have a strong turnout for this online event with the Kansas Poet Laureate Huascar Medina from Topeka, and his program is going to be titled "May Our Voices Ring True," and I think he'll have some really inspiring things to say about poetry and creative writing and how that can help us define ourselves in the community and the world. And then next week is also, the week after that's also a busy week. On May 4th, we have May the 4th Be With You. That's our IT supervisor, Nathan, is leading that program. And we will have some members of the 501st Legion joining us on Zoom, and just kind of be maybe a little more informal, just kind of chatting about Star Wars, and they'll show off their costumes. And that's going to be 7 p.m. on Zoom. And on Thursday, May 6th, I'm really excited, another author event coming up. It's called Searching for Sustainability, and that's going to be with Wes Jackson, the president and founder of the Land Institute in Salina, and Robert Jensen. And they kind of have a pair of books out from KU Press that are both about Wes, and I think his work about sustainability and his work at the Land Institute. So that's going to be a whole lot of fun. Now back to what we're doing this evening, Kansas Boy. I'm so pleased to have with me the two editors of the book, Jeffrey H. Barker and Melissa Walker. Jeff is provost and professor of philosophy at Converse College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and also the grandson of A.J. Bolinger. And Melissa Walker is the George Dean Johnson Jr. Professor of History Emerita, also at Converse College. So they're colleagues. And you guys can tell us some more about, I'm sure we'll learn more about you as we go on through this. And yes, can't wait to hear what you have to share. So take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you for the invitation. Well, we really appreciate this and the chance to talk with all of you. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. This is our very first opportunity to talk about the book in public, and very pleased about that. What we thought we would do is talk for a few minutes about the book, about the origins of the book, a little bit about AJ, and about the place in history, and then open it up to questions and discussion. So as Sam told you, I am AJ's grandson, and I am older than dirt, which means that I had the good fortune of growing up and knowing AJ when he was from his late 70s through his mid 90s, through his death. It was a wonderful time. It was many summer times in Missouri, in the green grass, and listening to him for hours telling me stories about the Old West. For someone who was growing up in Southern California, that was about as foreign as you could get. So it was a wonderful thing to have happen. The story of the book is long and colorful, sort of like AJ's life. The book began in the 1960s when his children, Arthur Joel Bolinger's children, nagged him to put down a memoir about his life, which was, I hope when all of you read the book, was a dramatically interesting life. So he finally did it, and he finished it in 1967, more or less finished it. There were some things added later, and he typed it on legal paper. He sent a copy of it to his oldest son, Dwight. Dwight Bolinger was one of 20th century's most famous linguists, who taught at Harvard and Stanford, retired at Stanford. And Dwight had the typescript, and the idea was that if Dwight wanted to do something with it in the way of publishing it, that would be fine. There's no evidence that Dwight ever did. So that version passed to my cousin, Dwight's son, Bruce, who still has his copy of the manuscript. And then the original typescript went to AJ's younger son, to William Bolinger Sr. And when William Bolinger Sr. died in the early 2000s, my cousin, William Bolinger Jr., opened his father's safe and found the typescript. So he sent the typescript to my mother, AJ's youngest child, Mary Julia Bolinger Barker, who looked at it and said, I'm going to give this to Jeff, see if Jeff can do something with it. It was in reasonably good shape, a little bit rough in places. But what Dr. Walker and I did is we looked at that and contacted my cousins. We started comparing various versions, thought about what would make the most coherent narrative and the most interesting story, frankly, and put together, with the help of my cousins, the book that you have. It is, as I say, fascinating and colorful, as was AJ's life. If you stop to think about it, he began life in the 1880s on the Kansas prairie at the closing of the frontier, when his transportation was horses and wagons, if he was lucky. And before the end of his life, he was flying on Boeing jets to visit my family in Southern California, and he watched humans walk on the moon. It's a truly remarkable lifespan in the history of our country and in the world, and he loved every second of it. He was never one to reminisce too much about how he wished he were back in the good old days. He actually rather liked jets and that they served a good drink. So a little bit about our family that you might find interesting. Just as AJ had a colorful life, the Bolinger family has a very colorful history. It goes back to what is now German Switzerland, German-speaking Switzerland, and it was spelled with two L's at that time and pronounced Bolinger. My cousin Bruce tracked the family history all the way back to the 1300s in a small village in Switzerland, and he found a parish death book with the earliest recorded mention of my family. It's a death notice from a priest, and all it says is, "It is better for all of us that he is dead." So it's an interesting start to the family. We came to America because in the Great Awakening in the early 1820s, the Bolinger family decided that the prediction of the end of the world on a certain date was right. And they went up, gave away all of their goods and went up to the top of the hill. And when they woke up the next morning, they had no goods. And so they booked steerage on a ship to America. They landed in Baltimore, found work at a rope walk that made hangman's nooses, and ended up renting a house that turned out to be right in the middle of one of the most ferocious Civil War battlefields of the war, and quickly decamped at that point for more Western and perhaps less violent territories. Going to Kansas perhaps was not the best move for a less violent territory, but certainly it was a fascinating one. So I will be happy to tell you more AJ stories as you want, but what I'd like to do is ask my co-editor if she could tell us a little bit about the historical significance of the memoir.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm happy to be here. Thank you all for joining us. And I'll start by talking just a little bit about the process of documentary editing, which is a special niche in historical writing. I think that's part of why Jeff asked me to work with him on this, because I had done a little bit of this. And what it involves is taking a story written in the past, a first-person account, and editing it in a way that it tells a coherent story, but also remains very factual and true to the author's intent. So minimal editing. And then also you need to put some things in context, because of course there are things that AJ references that the average person doesn't know anything about. There were things that Jeff and I knew nothing about. And so part of the process of editing this book was figuring out which versions, as Jeff mentioned, which versions of particular stories to use and how to weave it all together. But it also involved then going through and adding explanatory notes for things that the average reader today wouldn't understand. And then writing an introduction that tried to place AJ in some larger historical context. And as I read the typescript manuscript on the legal pad, legal paper, I was fascinated because it gave a very interesting view of what life was like at a very transitional time in American history, and particularly in the history of the West. He watched the frontier, what one historian has called close. He watched, as he grew up, the frontier went from being open land with a lot of new settlers moving in to becoming settled land with very established communities. So a lot of the memoir really gives you a picture of how that process happened. It also gives you a picture of really important moments in Kansas history and in US history. Sometimes I tell people that AJ was the Forrest Gump of the Kansas prairie, because like the fictional character of Forrest Gump, AJ was at these fascinating moments. His family goes on a camping trip when he's a child, and they witness an Oklahoma land rush. As we may talk about a little bit later, as a college student, he helps Carrie Nation raid a saloon. But he also has a lot of commentary on national events like the Spanish-American War. And he really gives you a sense of what it was like to grow up in that time in Kansas. He also gives you a sense of some of the hardships of that time. His family, for example, saved their money, hired a crew to make bricks to build them a fine new brick house. Before those bricks could be fired, there was a torrential downpour, and all those bricks dissolved into mud again. And of course, they didn't have any money left to pay the crew to redo the bricks. So there went that dream literally downstream. You get a real sense of how an agricultural depression could devastate small town merchants, how being on the wrong side of a political issue could thwart your economic ambitions. And this happened to both AJ's dad and to him. So you just get a really interesting picture of life on the ground for an average American in Kansas at this time. And at times, AJ comes across as really ahead of his time. For example, he's unusual in that he's and of course, he's writing as a man in his 70s, but he's very critical of the federal and state governments and of white settlers for their treatment of Native Americans. He's very critical of the romantic notions of the Old West that were so popular on television in the US in the 50s and 60s and in the dime novels. But he could also be really old-fashioned. He doesn't say very much about women, but when he does, he at one point he says he doesn't approve of the way young women, quote, make themselves into playthings. So he wasn't very fond of those wild women of the 1960s, I think. So he really is a man with keen insights, and he's as much a philosopher as a chronicler or a historian. He really interprets what he's seen. And that's one of the things that makes the memoir so interesting and so valuable. So I think Jeff has a small section of the book that he wants to share, and then we can open the floor up to questions.
Thank you. And Melissa was far too modest, so I'm going to say it for her. She is one of the leading, if not the leading, historians of the oral traditions, especially in the South. I strongly recommend her other books to you. They are wonderful, wonderful reads. One of the things that is interesting, I think, for historians about A.J.'s memoir is that he likes to think that he is debunking a lot of myths that, as Melissa said, were prominent in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s about the Old West. And he is more often than not correct. However, as is often the case with critical histories, there's more than one plausible version. That doesn't mean there's no truth. It means there's more than one plausible version, and the interpretations of the versions vary. So what you get from A.J. is one interpretation of a version, and as I say, more often than not, he's correct. But what I'd like to do is read to you a brief passage from the story. It's about for historians of the West and of Kansas, it's a fairly famous story and a grisly story that occurred about 12 miles from Thayer, one of A.J.'s homes, just before A.J. was born. And I'm reading this in part because I think it's just fascinating, but also because the version that A.J. gives us is probably the most plausible version, especially the ending. But there are three others. So I'll go ahead and start this. And this starts on page 37. He said, the other matter which in a way made Thayer famous, or perhaps infamous, was the fact that it was the nearest town of any consequence to the tavern operated by the Bender family. With that tavern, by the way, this was a shack over which there was a sign that said groceries, but it's known as the Bender Tavern. With that tavern was connected as lurid a piece of sensational news as was ever dreamed of by Nick Carter or any other writers of the dime novel era. At this time, immigration toward the West was still quite largely by wagon. Travel by rail was expensive and in many places unobtainable. The covered wagons in use at the time were not the huge Conestoga wagons of the traders' trains. They were simple farm wagons, 2 sideboards high and with a canvas cover. There were 4 bent wooden bows slipped into sets of slots on the outside of the wagon box, and over these were stretched the strong white canvas, securely tied down at the sides and with a drawstring that could close either or both ends. The driver's seat could be placed inside this cover or by moving it forward to the front of the wagon, and the driver using a footboard attached to the front, he could be outside the wagon and the inside front closed. This was the preferred way, for most of these immigrants had to bring with them household goods, as much as they possessed. Some farm tools, perhaps a plow tied on one side, a crate of chickens fastened at the back end, and a cow trailing at the end off a rope. Naturally, progress was slow and night stops frequent. To accommodate such travelers, some farmers put up additional room and accepted guests for the night. The Bender place was such a tavern, a large, well, I suppose large, not terribly, a large rough frame house of one huge room on the first floor, divided by a curtain stretched across a midway. The curtain was actually a stolen wagon cover from one of their victims. One end serving as a living and dining room and the other as a kitchen. The upstairs held one large room used as a combination bedroom for the family. There was a shed room at one side which could be called into service if needed. The family was German, the mother and the father speaking with a pronounced accent. There was a grown son and daughter. They had a great reputation for piety, for it was almost a constant sight to see Papa Bender sitting in a kitchen chair, tilted back against the wall close to the front door, and with a German Bible open before his apparently deeply interested eyes. The tavern was on a much traveled road leading between 2 important towns, Parsons and Neodosha, about midway, and was well located to catch travelers on their first night out from Parsons on their westward trek. What he doesn't say here is that one of the reasons why the tavern was such a popular stop is that there was no water anywhere until you got 3 miles beyond the tavern. So in a time when water was precious, it was a good stop. There was nothing thought of this place other than many of its like, until more and more people traveling west failed to arrive at their destination. They could be traced as far as Parsons, and then the trail went blank. So persistent grew these rumors that attention was directed ever more sharply at the Benders. One man coming from the east was so persistent that the Benders took flight. They were there one day and the next gone. Immediate investigation showed the yard at the Bender Tavern to be a well-occupied burial ground. Some of the victims were identified, some were not, and many more who had disappeared were never found. Nor were the Benders ever heard of again, and their complete disappearance was one of the most highly discussed mysteries of the time, not only locally, but throughout the United States. How they could so completely disappear was beyond comprehension, with all the publicity given them and their crimes. The wounds on the victims led to the supposition that their death had occurred in this manner. And this is, by the way, the reliable historical account. The dining table was placed quite close to the curtain dividing the room, and the guest would be seated with his back to the curtain, so that when he would lean back a trifle, it would push back onto the curtain. While Mama and Papa and Sister Cat entertained the guest, Brother would slip into the kitchen, and when the guest leaned back and his head bulged the curtain, Brother would crush it with a conveniently placed sledgehammer. As I said, no one ever knew what became of the Benders, but there has arisen of late years a legend, reasonable in its sound, that the citizens of Neodesha formed a posse and started to the Bender place and met them as they attempted to escape. That complete and summary justice was done on the spot, the Bender property destroyed and scattered, and that their evil remains now repose in some spot near the scene of their crimes, truly unloved, but not forgotten. Well, that's one possible account. There are three other possible accounts, some involving a state senator from Kansas. And I will refer you to the notes in the book on that. What happened after the brother crushed the head with a sledgehammer was he dragged the victim behind the curtain, where the Benders had created a trap door underneath the stove that led down to the basement, or the cellar actually, and then there was an outdoor, there was a door from the cellar out to the yard, and they buried their victims. So again, an interesting story, a grisly story, a true story. How it actually ended depends on who you listen to as to which posse got them, or one version that they were seen further west having escaped. So just one quick story from AJ's not personal experience, but from where he grew up. And now, unless Melissa, you'd like to say anything else, I'm glad to take questions.
I think I'm ready to hear what folks want to know.
Yeah, thank you, too. That's all fascinating, and I'm sure we'll get some great questions. Those of you in Zoom, you can type you have two options. You can type your questions in the chat, or you can use the Q&A button. Either one will work. And those of you on Facebook can type your comments on Facebook or questions on Facebook, and I'll see it there. So hopefully some of you start working on that, some questions. I was thinking that maybe you could tell us a bit about AJ and his involvement with Carrie Nation and the saloon raids, because that piqued my interest when I heard that was something that he was interested in.
Would you like to, Melissa?
Go ahead.
Okay. AJ attended what was then Washburn College, and he attended that after the Southern Kansas Academy. He was fortunate that Washburn started a law school in time for him to combine the last part of his undergraduate education with what was planned to be his legal education. He never finished, but what was planned to be his legal education. And while he was at Washburn as a college student, Carrie Nation began her efforts to reinforce temperance in Kansas. At that time, the temperance laws were not rigidly enforced, and it was actually a wonderful corrupt system where even while temperance was the law, there were more than 40 blind pigs operating openly in the city, as long as they paid fines or bribes, as you would prefer to call them, to the police. So Carrie Nation came in to try to put some steel into the spine of the temperance laws. Now, when she arrived, she was distinctly unpopular, of course, with the saloon owners and their wives, one of whom recorded that she waited till Ms. Nation leaned over certain ways and then hit her in the best possible place with a broom. But what AJ did was get together with his Washburn College buddies and decided they would join Carrie Nation in raiding and smashing a saloon. What's fascinating and what's impossible to distinguish is whether he was serious in his temperance efforts or whether AJ and his college friends were having a good night out. Knowing my grandfather, I think either one is possible. But he did, as Melissa said, he was sort of the Forrest Gump. He was with Carrie Nation. He's recorded exactly which saloon he smashed. And he went on to be at many other interesting historical places.
So these saloon raids, they were done, were they, I mean, I'm curious, like, you know, I mean, it's not legal to smash up property, but the saloons weren't legal either. So I'm just wondering how this was regarded by the local authorities or by the populace in general.
Badly. She ended up in jail. She was beaten and also jailed.
Okay. I'm kind of, I've got the book here, and I'll say this is part of the collection at Newton Public Library now. So you all can go on our online catalog and put a request in for this and check it out. Of course, there's also options to buy it that we'll kind of plug at the end here. But I'm looking through it. Yeah, talking about documentary editing, and this is the subfield of historical writing that you talked about, and it's really detailed. Well, I don't know if people can see it, but really detailed notes section at the back, and then an introductory essay. So I guess where do you start? Where do you start with that? How did your process? Did you just make a copy of it and start marking it up? How did you get started on that, and how do you develop that kind of a context for the book?
Well, first we had a very wonderful student worker who entered it all into Word, which was really a godsend for us, because otherwise we would have spent a long time entering that into Word. And the first thing we did was then go back and check her entries for accuracy and begin to check it against the other versions of the memoir that had emerged and develop a single text. And then once we did that, we started going through the chapters and trying to identify things that we knew that modern readers wouldn't understand, or to look to research place names and be able to give some context to the place names. Or he would make references to things like William Jennings Bryan, which famous orator and politician of the late 19th century that a lot of people who are really into history would have heard of, but other readers might not have. So we would pick out terms like that, or even some of the 19th century words for common things. I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but we would research these things and develop notes. And sometimes that was really like going down a rabbit hole, because we used a lot of the same tools that genealogists used. This was a much richer book because we had access to Ancestry.com. And we could actually, through all the digitized records at Ancestry, we could get a lot of small town newspapers and read stories about events that he referenced. And we could trace family trees, not only of the Bolinger family, but of a lot of the other local people he referenced. So that was just a fascinating process. And then once we had done that and been through the manuscript multiple times, we were ready to begin writing an introduction that gave a summary of his life, but did it in the context of what's going on in Kansas, and to a lesser extent, what's going on in the United States at the same time.
I can give you an example of what Melissa was talking about, and at the same time answer the question that's in the chat, which is, I was hoping someone would ask. It's an excellent question. A.J. was an attorney who studied law at Washburn College School of Law, but did not complete it because, as he said, he was more interested in his lovely new bride, Gertrude, than in finishing his law degree. And at that time, you could practice law by reading law with an established attorney and then taking an exam, usually an oral exam with a senior judge. And that's what A.J. did. One of the things that I did as a child was sit and listen to his stories about being an attorney and later a judge. He was a judge for almost 50 years. But one of the things I never knew was what drew him into the law. And this will help me answer the question in the chat, which says, for those of us who aren't yet familiar with his life, can we offer some of the highlights or the range of his adult Kansas experiences? Many of his adult experiences were in Missouri. And the thing about the book and the memoir is that it covers only the period from his birth through his departure from Missouri. We deal with some of his life in Missouri in the essay and in the notes, but he chose to end his memoir more or less with his departure from Kansas City, which was his last place, I believe, in Kansas. It's an interesting story because in the documentary history of our work, what I was able to do was go back and read his old legal cases. I was able to read the cases from Missouri after he moved to Missouri, but I also went back and read the cases in Kansas. And it was fascinating because he began as what we might think of as a general practice lawyer. He would take on cases that walked in the door, but he quickly discovered that he would make more money working for the railroads. So he became a railroad attorney at a time when railroads were either getting sued or suing people almost by the minute, both because of liability issues with the operations of railroads and because of the railroads' desire to create very strong power relationships in land relationships in the West. So he represented the railroads while he was in Kansas. And then when he left Kansas and went to Missouri, he became more of a general practice attorney, again in Morgan County, Missouri. He soon moved from being an attorney in Morgan County to being a judge. He was appointed and then elected and re-elected until the 1960s. And when he retired from being a judge in the late 1960s, he didn't retire. He went back into the practice of law in Versailles, Morgan County, Missouri, with his very middle-aged adult son at that point. You can imagine having your own legal practice for the last 30 years, and all of a sudden your father decides he's not going to be a judge anymore and he's going to move into the office with you. That's what his adult life was like. And at that point, the people of Versailles tell me, and I had some firsthand experience of this, that he was in his 80s and he was still driving at his insistence. And so when you saw A.J. out on the road, you just got off the road. You waited until he got to wherever he was. So it was a fascinating life. But again, most of the adult life, which is not in the memoir, was in Missouri.
And I'll just add that the first chapter of his career is in Oklahoma. He goes to Waleetka, Oklahoma, a small town, and this is just as Oklahoma is becoming a state and forming counties, and there's an enormous competition among the small towns in Oklahoma to become the county seat of each county. And AJ is not only practicing law, but he's running a small newspaper, and he becomes very involved in the campaign to make Waleetka the county seat of the particular county, the name I've forgotten now. And Waleetka loses. And he finds that has a very negative impact on his law career because he's been so outspoken. And that sends him back to Kansas as a young man. And at that time, he had a wife and a very young son. So needed to make a living and headed back to Kansas.
And in both of his adult periods in Kansas, he did have jobs. person in the chat asked about his range of experiences, but the jobs were what you might think of as occasional things. He was a rider on the cattle cars for the railroad, which was required at that time by state law, because the cattle needed to make sure that they had sufficient water for the long journey from the railhead in southeastern Kansas to the terminus in the big city. And the payment that you would get is you get the free rail ticket to the big city and some money, and all you had to do was make sure the cattle had water. So he did have that. But what's interesting, I think, about most of his life, as long as his parents were alive, they were profoundly focused on his education and his brother Bill's education. So while you might think of someone needing to work all the time, they actually changed their lives at various points, moved to different towns in Kansas, just so he could be near the school that they thought would be best for him and for his brother Bill, and they paid for it. They worked very hard to pay for his schooling. That's something, by the way, that lives on in the family. We have a long tradition of educators in the family, and it comes from that really interesting founding where it was so important to them that that oriented much of their lives.
There were occasions when they made significant moves so that the boys could get a better education.
You mentioned several different relatives and family branches that these the manuscript or the typescript came down through. I'm kind of wondering, in the process of researching this book and now that it's been published, how's it been received in your family, and what has it done to maybe, I don't know, bring you together around memories of your grandfather and stuff like that?
They're crazy happy. I mean, the only regret is that my mother did not live long enough to see this. She was the last surviving child, the youngest child. But my cousins, AJ's grandchildren, are extremely happy about this. They contributed. One of the things that's great about working with the University of Kansas Press is that they took pictures that were in pretty rough shape and did wonders with them and put them in the book. But most of those pictures come from my cousins. Some came from my mother. They're very happy. In fact, I was looking on the list of attendees to see if any of my cousins were on there. They told me they might attend, but they're in Kansas City and in Columbia, Missouri, and in Palo Alto, California.
Cool. I was kind of wondering, I wonder if when you started this, I know that I imagine people have different storytelling styles, and some might be more factual than others. And so I guess, did you have a sense of what AJ's, what he was like as a storyteller, whether he was scrupulous about the facts or not, and then did that change as you were researching and fact checking everything?
Well, Jeff knew him, so had some sense of how he talked and how he told stories. I think he did try to stick pretty much to the facts because, of course, we ended up doing a lot of fact checking in the process of editing this and adding the notes. And we found places where his interpretation might be different from someone else's, like the Bender Tavern story. But we didn't find any places where he got it wrong.
And I think his decades on the bench influenced his attitude toward that. He would not abide an attorney who didn't tell him the truth in his courtroom. And he took that standard to himself. But as a storyteller, Sam, he was the kind of person that if he walked into a room with a large group of people, it was a small group of people. He was the center of attention in every room. He was a wonderful, wonderful storyteller.
Yeah. Cool. Let me see. You mentioned the agricultural crises that were happening during his childhood and young adulthood. Could you say a little bit more about that and the how he observed those conditions when he was growing up?
I should have marked the spot where he's talking about that. But he talks at some length about how it was very difficult. It had a trickle-down effect anytime there was any kind of an agricultural downturn, because that meant that the farmers could then not buy equipment. They had trouble buying even ordinary supplies like seed and cattle feed, and that then had an effect on merchants. And his father is at one point running a store. And so when there is a downturn, that has a very personal effect on the family.
Oh, and another thing you mentioned, political disputes thwarting ambitions, and then you mentioned that that's kind of the county seat issue led to his leaving Oklahoma. But then did you say that his father also had a kind of parallel experience with politics interfering with his livelihood?
He did, although his father also made some decisions that complicate the Carrie Nation story for AJ. His father was most often a small town shopkeeper, though he styled himself a farmer. He wasn't particularly successful as a shopkeeper. In one case, because he took on a store that sold musical instruments, which even then and even today is not necessarily a profitable business. But earlier on, he had a small shop before they moved to the big city. And the temperance movement in Kansas was quite old. It went back into at least the 1870s and probably before that. And his father, AJ's father, was an early temperance advocate. So here was a shopkeeper in a small town advocating for the elimination of some other shopkeeper's business. His advocacy was successful along with everyone else in Kansas, because Kansas passed an early state temperance law. And when the law passed, AJ tells us his father decided he better leave town. His business dried up.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about the temperance and prohibition in Kansas in this, this late 19th century, but it does, from what it does seem like, maybe the politics of it back then, it doesn't really map neatly onto the left, right, the way modern politics are.
It does not.
Would you say that's the case? Yeah.
To go back to what Melissa was talking about in Oklahoma, in Weleetka, the politics there was about gaining control through your town getting the county seat. It would be identified with the movement would be identified with a particular political party, but it was less about political principles than about gaining economic power.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of temperance, temperance tended to be, the prohibition of alcohol tended to be a more Republican issue, and Democrats tended to support continuing the sale of alcohol, but it didn't map neatly, because it really did depend on the individual. It depended on the small town politics and who's allied with who in the small town. And a lot of people were driven by personal negative experiences with alcohol. That was the case with Carrie Nation, who had an alcoholic and abusive husband. So a lot of times, some of these issues, especially things like temperance, don't map neatly onto political parties then or now.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned that AJ in his later life, even though he helped smash the saloon, wasn't a teetotaler.
No, he wasn't.
So, yeah, so there you go. Let me see. Yeah, I'm curious. You know, they mentioned that he had some critical things to say about the treatment of Native Americans. Is this something that he talked about, witnessing the mistreatment of Native Americans, and or something that maybe he learned about later in life through his own studies? Or
I think that was more filtered through the lens of the adult AJ. He certainly had seen Native Americans growing up, and he certainly saw through the lens of a child, he saw the dispossession of a lot of Native Americans. But I think his criticisms of it as a US policy come more from his adult experiences.
They do. And when he was in Oklahoma, and when he took his legal exam before a judge, the particular judge who examined him was associated with what was then a complicated set of state and especially federal policy moves, including what was called the Dawes Act or the Severalty Act, that were supposedly to help Native Americans retain their land, but the way they were created and later modified did exactly the opposite. And so he had some personal experience with the origins of the Dawes Act and then how it evolved and the impact that it had.
So this is a kind of a little bit question on a little bit of a different tack. You know, some of the folks watching are family historians, genealogists, and I imagine some of them might have a manuscript or a typescript, whether it's book length or not, that's sitting in a drawer on a shelf somewhere. And I think I kind of know from my own experience and my family's experience, you know, that it's a blessing, of course, but it can also kind of feel like something that's hanging over you to try and do something appropriate with this family legacy in written form, you know. So I wonder if you have either of you have any thoughts about what someone who's, you know, not a professional historian, what they can do to or with these family memoirs and manuscripts and historical information to make them more useful, to preserve them, stuff like that.
Well, my first thought is not every manuscript is going to be publishable. Not every manuscript is going to tell a coherent enough story that will interest the average reader, but a lot of them do. So I think the first step would be to get some other, you know, generally well-read people, not necessarily professional historians, to read them and tell you, yeah, this is a really compelling, and give you an honest opinion. Is this a compelling story or not? And if it's a compelling story, then you might want to explore working with a historian who might work with you to publish it. I've worked with a couple of people now on publishing these family stories. Or certainly, even if it's not what you might consider publishable, I would explore archiving it in a local historical society, in a public library that has a local history collection, or even in the State Historical Society, because a lot of my work is so much richer because people put those diaries or those letter collections or those memoirs in an archive somewhere. And I was able to then go in and use those to tell a richer story about something bigger than just that one person's life. So absolutely, I'm a big fan of preserving all this stuff. Don't let it molder in your attic.
I think that's really good advice, and I think that can help us answer the second question in the chat. In terms of research, were the written records Mr. Bolinger created along with info from Ancestry sufficient, or was it necessary to contact sources outside of Mr. Bolinger's family for inclusion or verification? If so, how successful were those efforts? So if you think of the memoirs that you might find in your attic, you might think of them as pure memoirs, that is simply personal recollections, or they can be thought of as historically significant documents. And I think that the market for publishers right now for pure memoir is a very tight one. Unless you are independently famous or your relative was independently famous, it's very hard to get a publisher to publish a pure memoir. And what Melissa and I did is give the book, especially Melissa, the historical context that made the University of Kansas Press more interested in it, not simply as a pure memoir, though it is fascinating and funny, but also as a historical document. And the answer to the question is, because it is published as not just pure memoir, but also historical, we did go outside of the sources. We went outside of Ancestry. There's a tremendous amount of research that went into both the introduction and the notes. When you think about contacting family members for verification, we all know the risk of that. I did go to my family members and sometimes did and sometimes do get different versions of stories. So what we did, and Melissa is an expert on this, is go to original primary historical records. Go to the census records, for example. I would go to the original legal documents, the cases from the early 1900s. It's one thing to have someone say they did something, but we verified as much as possible.
And as all of you from Kansas know, there are some really wonderful historical accounts of the history of Kansas, and they provided us with a real framework for understanding this time period and this place.
You have really good archives in Kansas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just put in a plug here for the Harvey County Historical Museum. Great. I know that they've got archival collections like this, and we have some limited archival stuff at the public library as well. But definitely, I think that HCHM would be one to call if you've got something like that they might be interested in archiving or adding. I think this is probably good a time as any to start wrapping up. Do you have any parting thoughts or stuff that we didn't touch on that would be good to mention or talk about?
Well, the only thing I'll say is that I've lived this story my entire life, and I still like going back and reading the book. It is an amazing story, and I hope that all of you folks get the chance to read it.
And it's been a real privilege and pleasure to be able to dig into Kansas history. I knew a lot about agricultural history, and Southern history, but I didn't know very much about Kansas. And it was a real privilege to work on AJ's story because he was quite a storyteller.
Yeah. Oh, and I did think of one other thing real quick. Could you two each say a little bit about your other books or your other writing? I'm kind of curious what that might be.
I'll just say that I've mostly written on Southern agricultural history, Southern women's history. So I've got a collection of oral history accounts from women in the Southeast, a couple of books about Southern agricultural history in the early 20th century. And then I've got a book on the American Revolution in the South, and then I've got Kansas. So I guess I have eclectic interests.
They're wonderful books. I strongly encourage you. Not only the books on the oral histories, All We Knew Was to Farm, it's an excellent book, but also much of the American Revolution was decided in the South, and much of the final the final chapter of that revolution began in South Carolina, and you're looking at, in Dr. Walker, at the preeminent historian of that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
And Jeff, your other work?
Oh my. The concept of the state in Marx and early anarchism. Oh my. That's another story.
Oh,
And Jeff is
That's-
too modest. He does a lot of work on medical ethics, which is a far afield from AJ, but I think Jeff's becoming a philosopher may have something to do with growing up with such a philosopher of a grandfather.
It broke his heart, though. He wanted me to go into the law.
Mm.
He said he already had in his mind a place for me on the Supreme Court.
yeah, it's funny you talked about, you know, I come from a family of lawyers too, and you talk, my grandfather, he didn't ever really retire. Something about lawyers, they just want to keep going. I guess it's a rewarding profession in that. So, you know, and yeah, so I was like, aha, that moment there. Well, and cool. I think yeah, anybody, you know, we can get any book basically on interlibrary loans. So I encourage you to look up these two professors' other stuff, and we can happily order it for you and get it checked out. One more time, we've got the Kansas Boy, so put a hold on it, check it out. You can also purchase it. I believe that I saw it at Watermark Books when I visited the other day in Wichita. And you can go to kansaspress.ku.edu and order it from the website there. I saw it on Amazon as well. Am I missing any great ways to buy your book?
Well, and it's also available in paperback. So
That's true.
Yes, great. Okay, well, I will sign us off. Thank you again. This was really an interesting discussion, and I can't wait to read some more of this book.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sam. Thanks.
Thanks again. Have a great evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.